Where are the 12 tribes? Why did they disappear so abruptly, as if swallowed by time itself? And even more unsettling, why do the prophecies insist that they will return precisely when the world is on the brink of collapse? These questions echo like an ancient call, an open fissure in the fabric of history that no one has been able to close. For centuries, scholars, mystics, and archaeologists have pursued this shadow, but the more they investigate, the deeper the mystery becomes, as if the truth were hidden behind a veil that only fate could tear. You are about to enter a story that hasn't ended. A story that never died. A prophecy that, according to many, has already begun to move silently behind the wars, global crises, and spiritual upheavals of our time. The disappearance of the 12 tribes is not simply a forgotten chapter of Scripture. It is an open wound. It is an unpaid debt of human history. And, if the ancient prophets are right, this void will be filled so powerfully that it will shake the entire world. Imagine the ancient map crumbling, the kingdom of Israel divided, brothers against brothers, exile, bloodshed, invasions, deportations, the dust of ancient roads carrying men, women, and children to unknown lands. And in the midst of this chaos, the northern tribes, Ephraim, Manasseh, Issachar, Zebulun, Asher, Naphtali, Reuben, Gad, and Dan, simply disappear. Not overnight, but like a fire that silently dies out while everyone is distracted. They vanish from the records, from historical accounts, even from the lamentations. It's as if they were ripped from time. But here's the detail that no one dares ignore. They don't disappear from the promises. They don't disappear from the visions. They don't disappear from the divine decrees. From Isaiah to Ezekiel, from Amos to Jeremiah, all point to a moment when these tribes would return, reunited, restored, raised up as an overwhelming sign of the end times. And this return, according to the Scriptures, would not be discreet. It would not be symbolic. It would be a global, spiritual, historical movement, impossible to ignore. And that's exactly what puts the world on alert. Because today, people from all corners of the planet claim descent from lost tribes, groups in the mountains of India, communities in North Africa, tribes in Afghanistan, remote villages in Japan, native peoples of isolated regions. DNA studies are beginning to reveal coincidences that cannot be treated merely as coincidences. Archaeology finds fragments that together draw a hidden map. And the prophecies, once distant, are beginning to seem dangerously current. And here, at this very moment, arises the question you need to face. What if the return of the 12 tribes has already begun, and no one noticed? What if what we consider to be just ancient history is silently unfolding before our eyes? What if the prophecy that will shake the world is not in the future, but in the present? If you're feeling the weight of this question, if you sense that something profound is stirring behind the global chaos, then stay with me. Because now we're going to pierce the veil, enter the night when Israel was torn apart, and follow the clues that time has tried to erase. The mystery of the lost tribes is alive, and their return could change everything we know. Before we delve deeper into this millennia-old enigma, I need you to do something simple but essential so that this message continues to reach those who need to hear it. Like this video right now, comment below what you already knew, or what still intrigues you, about the disappearance of the 12 tribes, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next parts of this investigation. This isn't just an automatic gesture, it's a way of showing that you're truly engaged in this journey, understanding the weight of this content and helping to keep this discussion alive. Each comment opens another door. Each subscription keeps this study going, and each like helps this mystery reach more people who are also seeking answers. Now, if you've already done that, take a deep breath, because the next part will shake everything you think about the prophecy. Let's continue. The night Israel was divided was not merely a political event. It was a tear in the soul of a people who believed themselves to be unshakable. Imagine a kingdom built upon ancient promises, sacred covenants, symbols of unity and identity, suddenly shattering like broken pottery on the floor. The division didn't begin with swords. It began in the heart. A discord, a power struggle, an accumulation of tensions that no one controlled, and when the people realized it, it was too late. The northern kingdom and the southern kingdom were separated, distant, almost enemies. The feeling of irreparable loss fell upon Israel like a heavy shadow, and everyone felt that something profound had been broken forever. The people of the north walked under different flags, adopting mixed practices and foreign influences, and gradually their spiritual identity, the one that should have been eternal, began to dissolve. The temple still stood, but the faith was fractured. Political division transformed into spiritual division. Each tribe tried to survive, but the strength of the collective no longer existed. And when a kingdom loses its unity, it also loses its protection. This is one of the most ignored secrets of the scriptures. No external enemy defeats a people before they are destroyed from within. This is how the fall began. A weak king here, an ignored prophet there, a pact with pagan nations over there. The ancient pillars crumbled silently. The northern kingdom lost its essence, lost its focus, lost its strength, and when the storm came, the exile, the deportation, the cruel advance of merciless empires, Israel was unprepared. The tribes were swept away from their lands, separated from each other, pushed into the unknown, like dust carried by the wind. No one imagined that this would be the beginning of the greatest mystery in biblical history, the disappearance of the lost tribes. Chaos spread like wildfire through dry vegetation. Women mourned their children, men were marched in chains. Elders tried to remember each family's lineage to prevent their origins from being lost forever. But the distance was too long, the captivity too harsh, and the displacement too violent. As they crossed deserts, mountains, and borders, the tribes began to disperse like leaves carried by the current. Each step was a farewell to a piece of their own identity. The people were no longer just far from home. They were far from themselves. It is necessary to understand the spiritual weight of this. The promise given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was linked to the land, to blood, to the name, to the altar. When the tribes were uprooted, they carried with them only the memory. And memory, when not nourished, fades. The feeling of irreparable loss hung over Israel like a thick darkness. The prophets tried to warn, to shout, to plead, but their words seemed like wind beating against closed doors. The fall was not only geopolitical. It was emotional, spiritual, cultural. Israel ceased to be a nation and became a fragment. And here comes the most dramatic part of this whole story. When a people is dispersed, it doesn't disappear all at once. It dilutes, it mixes, it reinvents itself. It adapts to survive, and in the process it leaves clues, signs, traces that time tries to erase. The 12 tribes didn't vanish like smoke, they dissolved like ink in water. In each region where they were taken, they left echoes, customs, expressions, traditions that reminded them of who they once were. Imagine thousands of people carrying with them small sparks of identity, an ancient name, an inherited song, a ritual practice, but without realizing that over generations those sparks would transform into embers hidden under ashes. The night Israel was divided did not end when the sun rose the next day. It stretched for centuries, a long, dense, silent night. A night in which kings fell, prophets were silenced, temples were looted, and the people, scattered across the world, ceased to recognize themselves as part of a greater promise. And yet, however dark that night was, something remained alight: prophecy. Ancient texts said that Israel would be reunited. They said that the tribes would be restored. They said that in the last days they would rise up as a sign that history was reaching its climax. It's impossible not to feel the weight of it. When you look at the state of the world today, at crises, wars, global transformations, strange movements happening in silence, the feeling is that we are living the echo of that same night. The world is divided, fragmented, exiled from itself. And when you understand what happened to the tribes, you also understand that none of this is a coincidence. Every step they took, every land they touched, every culture they absorbed, is part of a larger enigma, an enigma that still pulsates. And here, before we move on to the next point in this investigation, I want you to write in the comments what you feel when you imagine this dispersion. Comment, "The night of Israel still echoes," or write what impresses you most about this story. This helps keep the conversation alive and allows this content to reach even more people who need to know about this prophecy. Let's continue. The silence that followed the dispersal was not merely an absence of words. It was a kind of void that seemed to breathe on its own, a space between eras where time moved slowly and the divine promise walked hidden. The tribes vanish from the records, disappear from the documents, evaporate from the chronicles of the kingdoms, and historians gaze at this gap as one faces an abyss that no one knows how to measure. But at the same time, this disappearance was never total. It was as if the tribes were covered by a mist that hid their trail, but did not erase their existence. The feeling is that you are following footprints in the sand that the tide insists on erasing, but which still leave a shape, a trace, a mark too subtle to be ignored. The world seemed to move on. Empires rose and fell, new cultures spread, kingdoms clashed, but the echo of the tribe's dispersal remained, lingering in the air like a murmur no one could pinpoint. And in that immense interval, in that empty space between the fall and the prophecy, the prophetic silence lasted for centuries. A heavy silence, a silence laden with mystery, as if God himself had suspended his voice for a moment, letting history move on without direct interference. But what many fail to realize is that this silence was not abandonment. It was preparation. The promise had not expired. It was merely maturing, germinating in the shadows, awaiting the exact moment to bloom once more. It's almost as if the tribes had been planted across the world, scattered like seeds hidden in foreign soil. They didn't appear in official documents, but they did appear in traces of culture, in vague memories of ancient traditions, in customs that made no sense to the local people, but which carried the silent mark of the ancient covenant. Isolated groups maintained practices of dietary purity. Others preserved chants reminiscent of psalms. Still others observed lunar cycles in a way similar to the descendants of Judah. Small, discreet, almost invisible signs, but which revealed that the story had not ended. It's strange to think that an entire people could be lost superficially, but not in essence. And that's precisely what makes this mystery so powerful in the biblical and prophetic context. The tribes disappear from human records, but not from the divine promise. They vanish from maps, but not from the plan. It's as if heaven had preserved each one of them, not in scrolls or manuscripts, but in a kind of eternal archive where nothing is forgotten. Human history records what it sees, but God records what is. And that's what kept the tribe's identity alive, even when they no longer knew who they were. This prophetic silence is unsettling because it forces us to look at the gap and ask, why? Why would God allow part of his people to be diluted in the world? Why would he let the promised identity scatter like the wind? This question is at the heart of the mystery. And the answer lies in the very pattern of biblical revelation. Whenever something seems to be lost, it is actually being prepared for an even greater return. Chaos makes way for restoration. Emptiness makes way for revelation. Absence makes way for a return that no one can ignore. Imagine living in that era, centuries after the fall. No one knew for sure where the tribes were. There were only rumors, fragmented stories, legends that traveled like dust carried by the wind. It was as if the world was waiting for something, sensing that an essential part of the divine plan was still unfinished. The scriptures spoke of a grand return, of a gathering that would shake the nations, of a people who would arise from the ends of the earth. But faced with the silence, many began to doubt, others became complacent, others simply forgot. And yet, the promise remained intact. This contrast between absence and promise creates a powerful spiritual tension. It's the kind of tension that awakens curiosity, expectation, reverence, because if God promised, silence is not the end. It is merely the interval between the spoken word and the fulfilled word. The lost tribes were not dead, they were hidden. Hidden by time, by empires, by cultural mixing, by geographical changes, but not hidden from God. And the more we think about it, the more we realize that this void is, in fact, an essential piece of the prophetic narrative. If the tribes were easily traceable, if they were preserved in a clear and obvious way, there would be no mystery, no search, no prophetic expectation. The silence of the tribes amplifies the impact of their return. The greater the void, the greater the roar of the revelation, and this silence, however long it may have lasted, did not extinguish the spark of promise. On the contrary, it made the mystery more vivid. It caused scholars around the world centuries later to still search for these clues, connecting genetic traits, cultural practices, oral histories, trying to reconstruct an invisible map that traverses time. And the deeper one delves, the clearer it becomes that this silence is not natural. It is orchestrated. It is part of something bigger, something that is still moving, something that deep down we all feel is about to emerge. Before we continue, I want you to comment below what this silence evokes in you. Write, "Silence hides the promise," or share your own theory. This greatly helps to strengthen engagement and allows this prophecy to reach more people who are also searching for answers. Let's move on. So let's move forward, maintaining the same intense pulse, the same atmosphere of prophetic mystery, without conclusion, simply pushing the viewer into an even deeper tunnel. Prepare yourself, because now we enter the layer where the invisible begins to stir. What many people forget, or perhaps never realized, is that amidst the centuries-long silence, there was a pulsating thread of promise, an invisible line connecting the past to the future, as if time itself were waiting for the exact moment to reveal what had always been there, hidden. And it is at this point that two voices appear, echoing like spiritual thunder: Isaiah and Ezekiel. Prophets who not only spoke, they announced a return so grand, so impossible in human eyes, that even today, with technology, archaeology, and information, it still sounds like something destined to shake the world. Imagine Isaiah, centuries before any complete dispersion, saying that the people would be taken to all nations, yes, scattered to the ends of the earth, but that one day they would return. Not as scattered individuals trying to rediscover their identities, but as entire tribes, restored, reunited, recognized, rebuilt. He speaks of a return from the north, from the south, from the east, and from the west, as if he were seeing a map being reanimated by celestial forces. The description carries an almost cinematic energy. Multitudes emerging from forgotten regions, families that history swore were lost emerging again, an identity resurrected by the very voice of God. And then Ezekiel enters, with an even bolder tone. He doesn't just speak of return, he describes a reunification. He sees the broken pieces of the kingdom, the scattered fragments being gathered, fitted together, healed. He sees two pieces of wood becoming one, the famous vision of the two sticks, one representing Judah, the other representing Joseph or Ephraim. And when he joins these two sticks, God says, "I will make them one people." This is not poetry. This is a spiritual, historical, political, and cosmic promise all at once. It is God saying, "What you think is impossible, I have already determined will happen." And what's most impressive, this prophecy doesn't speak of a partial, timid, discreet return. It speaks of something global, something that makes headlines, that shakes empires, that alters borders, that defies human logic. The prophecy points to an event of such magnitude that when it begins, no one on the planet will be able to ignore it. Isaiah speaks of signs among the nations. Ezekiel speaks of a restoration so absolute that the whole world will understand that it was not the work of men, but of God himself intervening in history. And notice the detail that makes everything even stranger. These prophecies don't match what has historically happened so far. Yes, there have been returns. Yes, there have been reconstructions, but nothing, absolutely nothing, comes close to the scale announced by these prophets. Nothing comes near the promised global dimension. Nothing reflects the complete picture of the reunification of the 12 tribes. It's as if we're living in an interval, a silence before a shock, as if we're approaching something that hasn't happened yet, but which was announced with disturbing precision. And as you listen to this, perhaps you're already feeling that strange sensation that something bigger is happening behind the veil of history. Because if these promises weren't fully fulfilled in the past, then they're still alive. And if they're still alive, that means that every geopolitical movement, every archaeological discovery, every spiritual shift in the world could be part of a much larger scenario. A scenario that points to the return and reunification of the tribes as a decisive milestone for the future of humanity. Before we move on to the next part, which will delve even deeper into this vision and show how these prophecies began to subtly manifest in the modern world, I want you to tell me in the comments, were you already familiar with the prophecy of Ezekiel's 2 rods? Comment, "I want to see the revelation," if you're ready to continue, because now the story begins to accelerate. So let's delve even deeper, maintaining the same narrative thread, the same rising energy, because now we've arrived at one of the most provocative parts of this entire journey, the enigma of the North. It's here that the story seems to abandon the firm ground of logic and enter a kind of twilight zone where fantasies, legends, migrations, disappearances and mysteries mingle in a fog that has never been fully dissipated. And incredibly, it is precisely in this fog that many believe some of the lost tribes followed, hidden beyond the known borders, to regions that, at the time, were practically the end of the world. When the ancients spoke of the North, they weren't just talking about geography. This term carried symbolic, spiritual, and prophetic weight. The North was seen as a direction of mystery, of invasions, of silence, of things that came from the unknown. And it's fascinating to realize how, over the centuries, countless traditions began to point to the idea that entire groups, direct descendants of exiled tribes, would have crossed remote territories, crossed dangerous rivers, disappeared into icy valleys and endless mountains, as if they were being guided away from the eyes of the world until the exact moment they needed to return. This image of tribes advancing northward, driven by historical chaos, the collapse of the kingdom, and the empires that rose against them, creates an almost cinematic scenario. Imagine entire caravans moving forward, crossing icy deserts, braving storms, trying to preserve names, customs, memories, songs, and fragments of the Torah, even thousands of kilometers from home. It's impossible not to feel the emotional weight of this displacement. For many, this flight represented not only a matter of physical survival, but of spiritual survival. And here comes a key piece, the so-called Northern River. For centuries, accounts have emerged of tribes that supposedly crossed a great river, a natural boundary separating the inhabited world from almost mythical lands. Regardless of how these accounts were recorded, what matters is that they are repeated in different sources from different eras, as if echoing a very ancient memory, a collective recollection that something great was carried beyond the reach of civilization. Many believed that this river was more than just water. It was a prophetic dividing line. Whoever crossed it would disappear not only from the map, but from common history. And what's most intriguing is that from this point on, rumors begin to emerge about strange peoples living in remote regions, with customs reminiscent of ancient Israelite practices, rituals, traditions, symbols, stories passed down from generation to generation, peoples who couldn't clearly explain their own origins, as if they carried a fragmented, mixed yet still living identity, as if they had been shaped by paths too long to be remembered precisely. It's impossible to ignore these coincidences. They create a narrative tension that leaves anyone uneasy. Could they be echoes of the lost tribes? And the further you follow this trail, the more you realize that the puzzle is not simple. Some groups seem to have headed towards the mountains, others towards isolated plains, and still others may have split up mid-flight, creating new routes and new destinations. This opens the door to theories that have always fueled the imagination of researchers, religious figures, and even governments. What if the tribes didn't disappear? They just spread beyond what we can trace. What if their return is not just a historical repatriation event, but a prophetic fulfillment with global reach? This enigma of the North, this idea of hidden tribes waiting, concealed in silence, creates one of the densest atmospheres in the entire theme. It's as if a part of history is frozen in suspended time, awaiting the exact moment to awaken. And each new discovery, each artifact, each legend that resurfaces, each unexpected similarity between scattered peoples ignites a spark of suspicion. Are we closer to this return than we imagine? And before we move on to the next part, where the pieces finally start to connect, and you'll understand why so many theories point to a prophetic movement that may be happening now, I want you to comment something very simple below. Write "The North hides secrets" if you feel there's much more behind this mystery than traditional history admits. So let's move forward exactly where we left off, because now the story ceases to be just an ancient mystery and begins to touch on the territory where everything becomes urgent, alive, unsettling, and inevitable. The sign of the end. And here, more than ever, you need to pay attention, because this part connects everything we've seen so far. The rupture of the kingdom, the prophetic silence, the enigma of the North, with what many call the most decisive moment in human history, the end times, the return of the tribes, and the final manifestation of the Messiah. It doesn't matter if you grew up hearing this, if you're discovering it now, or if you always thought it was an exaggeration. The fact is that this prophecy appears and reappears like a shadow that spans centuries, and the more you observe it, the more you realize that it was never symbolic. It was always literal. The central point is simple. The gathering of the 12 tribes is not an optional detail, not a footnote hidden in little red verses. It is presented as a landmark, an eschatological trigger, a sign that should make the whole world stop. The restoration of what was divided, the reunion of what was scattered. The return of those who have walked from exile carrying ancient names, broken memories, and an identity that has always been waiting to be recognized. It is as if time itself had been extended, awaiting the exact moment when the pieces would finally return to their original place. And it is here that you realize that this prophecy was never isolated. It connects with the Messiah, with the throne, with the final restoration, with the conclusion of human history. Now imagine this actually happening, not as a metaphor, but as a real, visible, unavoidable movement. Imagine groups emerging, genealogies being traced, ancient trajectories being rediscovered, forgotten traditions resurfacing. Imagine peoples reclaiming their origins, seeking a return, trying to rebuild millennia-old ties. And while all this is happening, the world, distracted, polarized, immersed in conflict, barely notices that one of the greatest prophetic signs is silently moving. It is precisely this tension that places the topic on a completely different level. We are not talking about dead history. We are talking about pulsating prophecy. The interesting thing is that eschatology has always pointed to something very specific. The end doesn't begin with destruction. It begins with gathering. Before judgment comes the gathering. Before the restoration of the kingdom comes the return of the heirs. Before the full manifestation of the Messiah comes the return of those who were scattered. And this order was never accidental. The gathering of the tribes functions as a prophetic key, as if the divine plan itself were waiting for these children to rise again so that the next chapter could finally begin. It's as if the heavens were holding the clock, awaiting the final move on the board. And when you think about it more deeply, you realize the emotional impact. For centuries, these tribes were treated as vanished, forgotten, irrelevant, as if they had dissolved into time. But prophecy never treated them that way. Prophecy always spoke of them as alive, guarded, preserved, awaited, and the moment they begin to reappear, the whole world should feel the ground tremble. This return is not simply a matter of identity, it's an announcement, a sign, a clarion call. A clear message that the plot has reached the brink of climax. And here's the point that bothers so many people. The return of the tribes is not disconnected from the Messiah. It is completely intertwined with the final coming. In many traditions, complete restoration only happens when the king manifests himself. It's as if each tribe were a piece that needs to take its place so that the throne can be revealed. As if the Messiah were waiting for this alignment to fulfill what was promised from the beginning. This creates an almost unbearable eschatological tension, because if the tribes truly begin to assert their identity, if they truly begin to be recognized, if they truly begin to move, then we are much closer to the end of days than we imagined. And that changes everything. It changes how you read history. It changes how you understand the present. It changes how you look at global movements, conflicts, crises, migrations, and even religious tensions, because suddenly they are not just isolated events, they are pieces moving to form the final picture. And the more you observe, the more you realize that you can't treat this topic as theory. It starts to look like a diagnosis. It starts to look like a sign. And before we move on to the next part, where we'll connect the return of the tribes with current movements, geopolitical tensions, and intensifying spiritual signs, I want you to leave a comment below that will show me you're following this line of reasoning to the end. Right, time is running out, or the tribes are returning. This will help me understand who is truly following this study to the eschatological core of the prophecy. So let's pick up exactly where we left off, because now we're entering the part that makes many people hold their breath: modern evidence. This is where the ancient past ceases to be mere memory and begins to interact with laboratories, excavations, and global movements. This is where biblical prophecy intersects with science, technology, and the awakening of identity in peoples around the world. This is where the topic stops being distant history and becomes something tangible, measurable, unsettling, almost impossible to ignore. And the more you observe these signs, the more you realize that something strange is happening, as if the pieces of a millennia-old puzzle were rearranging themselves before our eyes. Think about it. For centuries, the question of the tribe's whereabouts seemed impossible to answer. It was like searching for dust in the wind. But suddenly, in recent years, clues, echoes, and traces have begun to emerge. Peoples who for generations have maintained customs strangely similar to Israelite traditions. Communities that claim to descend from ancient lineages. Oral narratives that have persisted in isolated regions, preserving names, symbols, and practices that, at first glance, should not have survived. And the most intriguing thing, many of these groups have never had contact with each other, and yet they share common elements. That alone would be enough to raise the alarm, but it doesn't stop there. Because now, a factor that never existed in ancient times comes into play: genetics. For the first time in history, it is possible to trace ancestries with precision. We are not talking about guesswork. We are talking about markers, patterns, sequences, codes that span centuries and carry memory. And when certain patterns begin to appear in communities scattered around the world, communities that claim Israelite descent, the question ceases to be, is it a coincidence? And becomes, why is this happening now? And this question is unsettling because it seems that the prophetic clock has decided to align itself with the scientific clock. And then you add archaeology to this equation. Excavations that unearth objects, inscriptions, fragments of history that confirm migratory routes. Discoveries that support oral traditions previously considered legend. Traces that show that groups really did move away, really crossed borders, really disappeared among foreign peoples. And the more these findings accumulate, the more that enigma of the tribes ceases to be myth and begins to gain structure, flesh, concrete directions. It's as if the earth were returning pieces that remained buried for millennia. But what is most disturbing, and at the same time fascinating, is not the science or the archaeology. It is the human movement. Entire peoples on different continents are beginning to claim Israelite origins almost simultaneously. It is a global awakening, simultaneous, unexpected. Some of them preserved traditions that seem to have stopped in time. Others reconstructed practices that were fragmented. And others simply felt that there was something dormant within them, something that was now calling back. It is such a broad phenomenon that it cannot be ignored. And then you go back to prophecy and you realize it always said this would happen. It always pointed to a return, an awakening, a call that would cross peoples and borders. And the question that's starting to bother a lot of people is simple and direct. Why is this happening right now? Why, after centuries of silence, are so many groups beginning to rise up with the same narrative? This doesn't seem like chance. This seems like alignment, like a summons, like a prophetic movement. And if you look closely, you'll notice that it's not just a claim to identity. There's a kind of spiritual recognition happening. A feeling that something bigger is moving, that an ancient promise is calling each tribe, each lineage, each scattered memory to take its place on the final chessboard of history. It's almost as if the world is being prepared for a reunion that no one else believed was possible. And when you connect this with what we talked about before, about eschatology, about the end times, about the return as a sign, everything takes on a different weight. Because we're not just talking about people curious about genealogy. We're talking about prophetic coincidences, about lines that intersect without logical explanation, about events that unfold precisely when other prophecies begin to intensify. It's impossible to look at all this and not feel that something bigger is happening behind the curtain. And before we move on to the next part, where we'll delve deeper into this global awakening and show how it connects with present-day spiritual and geopolitical movements, leave a word in the comments. that only those who have watched the video this far will understand. I want you to write lineage or prophetic awakening. This shows me who is truly diving into this mystery and seeing what lies behind these modern signs. So let's continue exactly where we left off, now entering a part of the topic that many people gloss over without realizing it: the invisible return. Because, contrary to what many imagine, the prophecy doesn't say that the 12 tribes will suddenly appear, descending in a bright light or marching in rows before the cameras of the world. Not at all. The return of the tribes, according to ancient texts, prophetic patterns, and even modern signs, doesn't begin with spectacle. It begins in silence. It happens in the shadows of history. It moves like a tide that advances slowly, but advances without stopping until one day no one can ignore it anymore. And when you look closely, you realize that this process has already begun. It's not theory, it's not empty speculation, it's not emotional exaggeration. It's something much more subtle, much deeper, and precisely for that reason most people don't notice. The prophecy is already in motion, but at a pace that only the attentive can perceive. It's like a spiritual clock that keeps turning even when human eyes think nothing is happening. And that's what makes it all so unsettling, because the more silent the movement, the greater the impact tends to be when it finally reveals itself. Think about it. Tribes disappeared from the records thousands of years ago. And yet now we are seeing peoples rediscovering ancient traditions, spiritual movements emerging in unlikely places, communities reorganizing around ancient identities, diasporas resuming rituals, reconstructing customs, recovering memories. This doesn't happen out of nowhere. This doesn't arise spontaneously. These things only awaken when there is a call behind them. And that call, by all indications, has already begun to echo. But this return isn't physical in the first stage. It begins within people. It starts as restlessness, as an inexplicable feeling that they belong to something greater, something ancient, something that was dormant. It's like a spiritual memory awakening after centuries, as if the soul recognizes something the mind doesn't yet understand. And no matter where these people are, in the north, in the south, in deserts, in metropolises, the movement is the same. A silent, individual, inner return, but one that is growing like a wave about to break. And the most curious thing is that the prophecy describes exactly this type of return. Not a spectacle, but a gradual, almost imperceptible gathering, like an ember that reignites before becoming a fire. It's the kind of movement that only becomes visible when someone looks back and realizes how much everything has changed without them noticing. And here's where fear comes in. Not that destructive fear, but reverent fear, spiritual awe, because when you put all these pieces together, you realize there's a convergence happening. People rediscovering their identity, peoples reclaiming lineage, religious movements mentioning prophetic return, ancestral traditions emerging after centuries of silence, geopolitical shifts aligning historical regions that previously seemed disconnected. It's a lot happening at once. It doesn't seem like a coincidence. It seems like alignment, and this brings a sense of inevitability, as if the prophecy were traversing centuries and reaching our time, but most people don't realize it, because they expect something grand, flashy, explosive. But the prophecy never promised that. It always spoke of a return that begins in the hidden, in the intimate, in the profound. Like a seed growing beneath the earth, invisible, silent, constant. And when it finally sprouts, no one can stop it. Perhaps this is the most unsettling point. While the world discusses other things, while eyes are focused on wars, crises, and global changes, something much older is moving beneath the radar. A silent gathering that could change everything. And when it finally comes to light, many will say, "How did we not see this before?" But those who are attentive, who understand the prophetic rhythm, who recognize the signs, already realize it is happening. And then you start thinking about the word return in a different way, because it's not just about walking back to a physical territory, it's about rediscovering your own identity, reconnecting with your roots, rebuilding broken memories. The return begins within, and only then manifests outwardly. It begins in the spirit, and only then reveals itself in the world. It begins in the invisible, and only then explodes into the visible. And if this is truly happening, then we are much closer to final fulfillment than most imagine. And when we move on to the next section, we'll enter the most uncomfortable part of this topic. The moment when the invisible return becomes visible, when what is happening in the shadows finally comes to the surface. But before we get to that phase, which is perhaps the most tense of this entire prophecy, leave a word in the comments so I know you're really following along. Write, "Invisible return," or "I am seeing the signs." This shows me who is truly seeing the movement behind the silence. The world keeps rushing by, distracted, immersed in screens, wars, political disputes, and endless crises, while something infinitely greater approaches in silence, something that doesn't depend on headlines, doesn't depend on human recognition, and doesn't need the permission of any modern empire to happen. There is an ancient, profound, cosmic movement that begins to pulsate again in the shadows of history. The final gathering, the day the 12 tribes will rise. And I'm not talking about a symbolic return, I'm not talking about spiritual metaphors. I'm talking about a real, dramatic reunion, laden with destiny, prophecy, and identity. A call that spans centuries like a fiery arrow launched from the beginning of the world, ready to strike its target right now. Imagine for a moment a scenario that seems more like a clash between the spiritual and the historical. Deserts inexplicably blooming again, forgotten regions of the planet witnessing movements of return, peoples who have never met awakening simultaneously, as if the same voice were echoing in completely different places. The question is, why does all this begin to happen at the same time? Because the bigger script was already written. Because there is a set time. Because there is a day that cannot be postponed. And when that day arrives, the whole world will realize, too late, that you were never in control of your own history. Imagine this moment as a cinematic scene, a vast valley illuminated by a light that doesn't belong to ordinary nature. On the horizon, groups emerge from all sides, each carrying symbols, memories, fragments of an identity that seemed lost. Men and women walk with the distinct feeling that they have been called, drawn by something they cannot explain, but which they recognize immediately, as if it had always been within them. It is the kind of awakening that doesn't depend on documents, archaeology, or human proof. It is a spiritual awakening, an inner calling, a seal engraved before birth. And when these tribes finally look at each other, not as scattered peoples, not as separate nations, not as disconnected descendants, but as a single lineage, something that lay dormant in the very earth ignites. A pulse, an echo, an activation. It is as if the very fabric of reality responds, as if mountains, winds, and seas breathe together at this reunion. The reunion is not merely physical, it is dimensional. Because the identity of the 12 tribes has always operated on two layers, the historical and the spiritual, the visible and the invisible, the human and the divine. This final moment will be so momentous that no world power can ignore it. No diplomacy will be able to contain it, no military force will be able to divert it, no technology will be able to predict it, because it is not a political movement, it is a decree. It is not a human decision. It is the fulfillment of something that was already decided even before the creation of modern borders. And the most intriguing part is that while many wonder, where are the tribes? Perhaps the real question is, They have already begun to move, and you haven't even noticed. Think about it. What would you do if you discovered that a global prophecy has begun to be fulfilled, not in the great centers of power, but in small villages, remote regions, hidden communities? What would you do if you discovered that there are people who are being drawn to dreams, visions, and feelings of belonging that they cannot explain? What would you do if you realized that the return is being prepared not by the spotlight, but by the invisible? That is precisely what transforms this scene into something so powerful and so terrifying, because what the world does not see is precisely what is about to explode before everyone's eyes. And most impressively, this final reunion is not just an ethnic gathering, it's a spiritual realignment of gigantic proportions. It's as if the mysterious lines that have always connected these tribes to the sacred are reconnecting, thread by thread, until they form the original network again. A network capable of altering destinies, breaking cycles, triggering global movements and awakening consciousness. A network that has the power to redefine the very structure of prophetic time. Because when the 12 tribes align, everything changes. Doors open, events are accelerated, hidden mysteries begin to reveal themselves. Imagine the intensity of that moment, each tribe approaching the center of this gathering as if reclaiming its own voice, silenced for centuries. Emotional faces, firm steps, the feeling of finally understanding why so many generations were persecuted, scattered, broken, and separated. It was all preparation. Everything led to this moment. The final reunion is not just a return, it is a historical and spiritual reparation at the same time. It is the healing of a rupture that shaped the entire world. Of course, many people will try to discredit, minimize, question, and ridicule it. It has always been that way. The invisible provokes discomfort because it forces people to realize that they control nothing. But you, who are here now, following this content, need to understand the magnitude of this. Every detail of what we are discussing is connected to themes such as prophetic fulfillment, lost identity, ancient lineages, spiritual restoration, the destiny of nations, and the grand final plan. It is no coincidence that you are watching this video at this exact moment. And I want you to think seriously. If this return is truly underway, what does that mean for the world? More importantly, what does that mean for you? Before we continue, comment with one word to show you've been following along so far. It could be return, prophecy, 12 tribes, or even I've awakened. Choose one and comment. This really helps the video reach more people. And don't forget to like and subscribe, because you'll want to be here when I reveal the next step in this mystery. This is where everything converges. This is where the entire script takes a deep breath before delivering the final blow. Because after everything you've seen, after every sign, every clue, every piece silently fitting into the spiritual chessboard of history, the moment arrives to confront the question that no one dares to ask, but that has always throbbed in the back of your mind. And this question is much deeper than it seems. It's not historical, it's not documentary, it's not archaeological, it's intimate, spiritual, provocative. It crosses centuries, crosses blood, crosses identity, and comes straight to you. In which tribe would your soul find itself? I'm not talking about genetics, I'm not talking about surnames, I'm not talking about records or geography. I'm talking about spiritual vibration, hidden identity, that inexplicable impulse that makes some people shiver when they hear about divine justice, restoration, lost lineages, prophetic destiny, the return of tribes, spiritual awakening. I'm talking about that inner spark that appears at certain moments in life and makes you question why certain themes affect you so much. Why certain stories seem familiar even though they've never been told to you. Why certain symbols awaken a sense of belonging that doesn't come from logic but from the soul. And that's precisely why this question is so powerful, because it's not tied to the story the world has told you, but to the story your soul already knows. It's as if, throughout the entire video, you've walked alongside these ancient tribes, witnessed their disappearance, felt the silence, observed their invisible return, accompanied their final reunion, and realized that all of this creates a kind of mirror, a spiritual mirror, a reflection that forces you to ask yourself, if I were there, which group would I feel I belong to? Which tribe carries my essence? Where does my spirit fit into this great prophetic puzzle? Think about this honestly for a moment. Some people would identify with Judah's protective strength, its sense of leadership, its raw courage, its unquenchable flame. Others would connect more with Issachar's spiritual sensitivity, its ability to discern times and signs, as if the soul had an internal compass pointing to what the world doesn't perceive. Still others would find themselves in Naphtali's perseverance, in the resilience of those who fight in silence, in the mental and spiritual agility of those who always rise again. There are also those who see themselves in Zebulun's silent discipline, in Levi's justice, in the profound wisdom of Ephraim and Manasseh, in Benjamin's hope. Each tribe carries a spiritual trait, an invisible mark, a signature of destiny that can resonate within you. And the most impactful thing is that when you begin to realize which tribe speaks to your soul, everything changes. The final return ceases to be a distant event and becomes an inner journey. You realize that it's not just a prophecy about ancient peoples. It's a call for modern awakening, for spiritual realignment, to understand that perhaps you're not watching this video by chance. Perhaps there's a reason why this story resonates with you so much. Perhaps what you feel isn't curiosity, it's recognition. That's why this question is so dangerous, so powerful, and so transformative. Because it forces you to look inward, beyond biography, beyond routine, beyond what the world says you are. It compels you to confront who you are on a spiritual level. In which tribe would my soul find itself? This question not only places you within the prophecy, but connects you to purpose, to destiny, to the calling. And when you awaken to this, everything that is happening in the world makes more sense. The crises, the global changes, the growing chaos, the divisions, the spiritual revelations, all of this is part of the final scenario, part of the stage where the tribes silently rise. And then you realize that destiny isn't something distant. It's getting closer, it's knocking on the door, it's moving pieces around the world. It's calling people who have no idea they're part of this alignment. The final return is already happening, and the question now is no longer if, but where do you fit in when it's complete? That's why I want you to think deeply, without rushing, letting your mind and spirit work together. Because this reflection doesn't end in the video, it doesn't end here. It accompanies you. It continues to echo, and since you've reached this point, the deepest, most provocative, most intimate point in the script, I want you to actively participate in this movement. I want you to comment below with the word that best defines what you felt just now. It could be belonging, it could be tribe, it could be awakening, it could be identity, it could even be I know who I am. Choose one. Write it down, leave this spiritual record in the comments. And of course, take the opportunity to like and subscribe to the channel, because in the next video, I'm going to reveal something that connects directly to this final question, something that will further expand this mystery and perhaps give you a concrete clue about your own spiritual lineage.